Well, today we spend a fair bit of time on the program talking about a man who was that rare thing in American public life, someone who, since he died on Monday, has drawn warm accolade and deep respect from across U.S. partisan politics. Colin Powell was a pioneer in the U.S. military and the U.S. government, someone whose youth and whose color, he was an African American when people in those positions were not, marked him out, but also whose career will forever be marked by one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions so far this century, to invade Iraq and depose Saddam Hussein. Colin Powell was America's first black Secretary of State, first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, first black National Security Advisor, and he has died at the age of 84, his family says, from COVID complications. And since his passing, tributes have been pouring in from around the world.
Well, I became friends with Colin Powell, who we just lost. Think of our Colin Powell. He's not only a dear friend and a patriot, one of our great military leaders and a man of overwhelming decency. This is a guy born son of immigrants in New York City, raised in Harlem in the South Bronx, graduated from City College in New York. And he rose to the highest ranks not only in the military, but also in areas of foreign policy and statecraft. This is a guy, and we talk about it, who had teachers who looked at this African-American kid and said, you can do anything.
What an incredible American. He obviously served with dignity, he served with grace. He was the epitome of what it means to be strong, but at the same time, so modest in terms of everything that he did and said, in a way that it was never about him, it was about the country. Broke so many barriers, and those barriers were not easy to break by any stretch. But he did it with dignity, he did it with grace. And because of what he was able to accomplish, it really did elevate our nation in so many ways.
The world lost one of the greatest leaders that we have ever witnessed. Alma lost a great husband, and the family lost a tremendous father. And I lost a tremendous personal friend and mentor. He has been my mentor for a number of years. He always made time for me, and I could always go to him with tough issues. He always had great counsel. We will certainly miss him. I feel as if I have a hole in my heart just learning of this just recently. First African American chairman of the Joint Chiefs, first African American Secretary of State, a man who was respected around the globe and who will be, quite frankly, it is not possible to replace a Colin Powell.
All of us here are fortunate enough to work in an institution that Secretary Powell has shaped, and one that continues to reflect his tremendous legacy. Speaking for myself, as a child of the late Cold War and the first Gulf War, I remember thinking there could be no leader bigger, no leader greater than someone like General Powell, whom we now know as Secretary Powell, at least in this building. He was an inspiration to not only my generation, but many generations of America.
Much has been said and written about Colin Powell's historic and distinguished career as a soldier and statesman. He was respected in a way that transcended partisan labels. He wasn't perfect. His speech in 2003 to the UN General Assembly claimed incorrectly that Iraq likely possessed weapons of mass destruction. It was based on information he was given and later learned to be false. It helped make a case for a war about which he had misgivings, and he would come to regret those remarks the rest of his life. But he never stopped trying to serve, even after leaving public office.
A cross-section of tributes there from top U.S. officials remembering Colin Powell? Well, today we'll hear from U.S. diplomats, activists, and community organizers who knew Colin Powell or encountered him through their work. First to Washington, and Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne. Ambassador Wayne served as a U.S. diplomat from 1975 to 2015, including as ambassador to Argentina, coordinating director for development and economic affairs, and deputy ambassador in Kabul, Afghanistan, and ambassador to Mexico. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Economics and Business Affairs under 3 Secretaries of State, including Colin Powell, and he was also Principal Duty Assistant Secretary of State, or Deputy rather, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. And Ambassador Wayne joins me now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador, for joining us. I don't know if you heard some of those, but of course you're in America. You probably heard lots of tributes to Colin Powell since he passed away some 24 hours ago. What has struck you most, and what would be your personal tribute to him?
Well, it was a very sad moment. I worked for Colin Powell during his entire time as Secretary of State. He was an impressive and inspiring leader. He was a man of great accomplishment, but always humble. He was a dedicated public servant, always interested in learning and sharing lessons with people, a great teacher in many ways. He cared about the people that worked for him. He trusted them. He gave them the benefit of the doubt, believing they would give the wisest counsel that they could. And he was just wonderful to work with. There are just so many wonderful examples of time with him, including I happened to be with him in Lima, Peru on the morning of the attacks of September 11th, and then how he responded to that and dealt with that going forward.
And just to further buttress the points that you're making there, there is a sense, isn't there, that he's someone in public life with a sense of integrity accepted on both sides of the political divide, something you don't see very much in American public life today.
Very much so. And he made it a point of being right up front with you. I'm going to look at both sides of the issue. You give me your best advice. I will think about it, and I'll come back to you. But it didn't really matter if you were a Democrat or a Republican. He made his judgment based on how you presented the facts and the arguments, and he went forward from there. And as was noted, he, as he would say himself, he wasn't a perfect guy, but he would work hard to learn from his mistakes, and he never gave up his strong desire to help others and to share with others. It was really amazing.
Absolutely. And his first tour of duty was in Vietnam, wasn't it? A conflict that defined an era for the US and did much to shape the young Colin Powell. And I read somewhere that it was seeing the corrosive effects of that war on the US military that shaped his views on foreign policy and his belief that war should be a last resort.
I think that's right. And then if you have to go to war, as he called himself a reluctant warrior, and he was, that if you have to go to war, you do so with the best assurance that you can come out on top and not have such a long, corrosive involvement as he lived through in Vietnam. And I think that guided him through his military career, through his service at the White House, including as National Security Advisor, and through his service at the State Department. As was noted, he was not enthusiastic about the plan to go into Iraq the second time in the early 2000s. He was persuaded and given false information that he presented to the United Nations on this, and as he himself said, he regretted that involvement in that situation for the rest of his life.
Well, let me just take you up on that point. point because, I mean, you're aware as well as anybody else that the history books have suggested that in those fraught debates over whether military action should be advanced in Iraq in 2003, that his voice carried a lot less weight than people like Cheney and Rumsfeld. I mean, did you get the sense that he was skeptical of the arguments for the reasons for going to war in Iraq, but that ultimately he lost that debate, or was he very much party to that process?
Well, he was certainly party to the process, but my strong impression was that he had very serious doubts about it, and that others carried the day, and that there was a strong determination on the part of the president, the vice president, and secretary of defense to go forward with this, and that his objections were not accepted. They were not carried. They did not carry successfully in the debate that went on during that period of time.
And I mean, he said later that he felt his instincts failed him on Iraq, but did he also speak about how he felt so distanced from the later Republican Party? I understand that when the insurrection happened on January the 6th, Colin Powell had tears in his eyes, and that was when he made the decision that he could no longer be a Republican.
Well, I think he was quite clear all along that whenever there was a presidential race or a decision to be made among candidates of different parties, he would look at that individual or the two individuals that were being presented. And so that is why he endorsed Barack Obama for president earlier. That's why he endorsed Joe Biden for president. And that's the philosophy that he shared with others. He indicated that though he had chosen to be a Republican, he had voted for Democrats who he thought were better than Republicans. And in the end, I think he came to represent a different view of democracy than many in the current Republican Party.
Please stay with us, Ambassador Wayne. Would like to talk with you a little bit more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our reflection with Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne on the remarkable life of Colin Powell, who has died of COVID complications at the age of 84. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegulu. Now, as you might have heard, Colin Powell, the first African-American to become U.S. Secretary of State, has died from COVID complications. The son of Jamaican immigrants, his success story was widely hailed as an example of what is possible in America. He inspired deep respect across the political spectrum. He was also a trailblazer as an African-American at the heart of government. But his reputation as a man of honor was tainted and tarnished by his advocacy of a war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, helping to swing international opinion behind the 2003 invasion based on intelligence evidence that turned out to be faulty. And Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne, who served as a U.S. diplomat from 1975 to 2015 and was a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs under 3 Secretaries of State, including Colin Powell, is still with me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And let's just continue with that Iraq theme, because it was that country that defined his career, wasn't it? The first Gulf War in 1991 planted him firmly on the world scene as, alongside General Norman Schwarzkopf, he led coalition forces to victory, and that made him a U.S. national hero.
It did very much so, and it was a strategy that he and General Schwarzkopf devised and approved, that they felt would assure rapid and complete victory. But they also had a modest view. They weren't aiming to change the regime in Iraq. They were just aiming to liberate Kuwait. They did that very quickly. They did it with fewer American casualties than many people thought would be the case. And so the United States came away from that conflict with a really strengthened reputation, and General Powell rose in the appreciation of many, including the President of the United States, because of his leadership at that time.
But then, of course, years later, it was Colin Powell who would make the dramatic case for ridding the world of Saddam Hussein before a skeptical United Nations and convincing the world that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which it didn't. How much did that damage his credibility in your assessment?
Well, I think it was a very damaging situation, and I think he understood that very much. So after this went forward and the invasion took place, he worked very hard, and I worked very closely with him in our efforts to provide economic assistance and reconstruction assistance to Iraq and to help Iraqis to rebuild a government and to rebuild their economy. So I think that part of his effort afterwards, at least part of the effort that I saw afterwards, aimed at the rebuilding, was motivated, I can certainly say on my part, by the understanding that it likely would have been much better if we had not invaded that second time to go after Saddam Hussein.
And I mean, presumably you, as a former Assistant Secretary of State under him and also an ambassador under him, someone close to the corridors of power and to the White House as you were, I mean, you saw him close up at the highest levels of statesmanship. But what was he as a person?
Well, as a person, he was a wonderful individual. He was very warm, and as I mentioned earlier, always very humble. Never had an attitude that he was better than anybody else. So reminding himself in a self-effacing way, he would remind you that he was from a humble background, that he made mistakes, that he had to learn along the way. And he had wonderful wisdom that he would share. He would, in our morning meetings of all the senior leaders of the State Department, he would often share vignettes and stories that he'd experienced along the way that taught him how to be a better leader, how to make sure that everybody on your team felt that they were valued and part of the team. And he did special things. He had a program where once a month he would get two children from very underprivileged backgrounds, often without two active parents, and they would accompany him to all his activities during the day. And he did that in part to bring them in, as he put it, to what the possibilities were for them, that they did have other doors that could be opened in the way that he had helped open doors and took advantage of those opportunities. And he never, ever gave up that working outside of his formal job to try to help other young people. It's tremendously impressive.
That's also a very impressive tribute there from you. But I mean, in those corridors of power, sort of take us into places that, you know, most of us would never have the chance to go. I mean, you get the impression that there's a lot of struggle for power and sort of dominance and trying to get the ear of the president and so on. How did he play that sort of politics? Did he play it at all in your assessment?
Well, I think that in every administration there is competition of ideas and competition between bureaucracies. And in some administrations, it's a more cutthroat competition, I would say, than others. There has often been, not always, but often been a rivalry in that sense between the Defense Department, Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State. And as you would suspect, the Secretary of State is often arguing for a diplomatic and peaceful approach to try to solve the problems, and the Secretary of Defense at times is pushing for a more vigorous and use of the tools that the Secretary of Defense has, military tools. That was certainly the case vis-a-vis Iraq in these years when he was Secretary of State. And I think he presented his arguments, but the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President of the United States were united in strongly pushing for military action in Iraq. And Colin Powell just didn't carry the day. He was one of the voices raising questions, but that didn't carry the day in these discussions. And it actually also led to a lack of cooperation between the Defense Department and the State Department and USAID going forward after the invasion. It took a number of months between the civilians who were working in Iraq to try to help rebuild the economy, could actually talk to the State Department, their State Department colleagues like me, about ideas of how they might help to rebuild that economy. It took a while to heal that rift, and I think it was a very costly rift at that time between the State Department and the Defense Department. And this rift was also, in difference of opinion, was also there between the United States and its allies, a number of whom were very skeptical of this invasion.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I was in Britain at the time, and the UK, which is a staunch ally of the United States, was definitely very skeptical. Certainly the ordinary people. But the fact that there have been such bipartisan tribute since he passed, I mean, it almost feels like this is a very different era. Is it possible, dare we hope, that Colin Powell's memory might bring America back to that era when tribalism, political tribalism, was not something that was encouraged?
I think it's interesting that within the same year you've seen George Shultz and Colin Powell pass, and both of them were very much honored for their ability to work across the aisle and were the sort of examples, the models of that period of what bipartisan work on foreign policy and international affairs could do. And I certainly hope that General Powell, Secretary Powell's passing, as well as George Shultz's, will remind people that we need to get beyond this tribalism. And especially when we're working on problems that involve the rest of the world, we have to find common ways forward. And in fact, one of the most important security threats to our country is division.
Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne, we thank you exceedingly for joining us there from Washington, and he was a U.S. diplomat under Colin.